Breaking news out of Ottawa. And folks, what I'm witnessing as a constitutional attorney and someone who has spent decades analyzing policy decisions is nothing short of a complete economic paradigm shift in North America. While the administration was using tariffs as leverage to bring Canada to the negotiating table, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney just unveiled a counter strategy that has trade analysts across Washington completely stunned. And here's the kicker that nobody saw coming. Instead of seeking preferential exemptions like everyone expected, Canada is building an entirely new economic foundation that doesn't depend on American market access alone. This is not a defensive posture. This is a calculated offensive move that could reshape North American trade for generations to come. Let me set the stage with the facts because, as someone who has argued cases at the highest levels, I believe firmly in evidence based analysis. On February 1st, 2025, President Trump signed executive orders imposing 25% tariffs on nearly all Canadian goods, representing the most significant trade action against America's largest trading partner in modern history. Energy exports received a lower 10% tariff rate, but the scope was absolutely unprecedented. The stated goals included pressuring Canada on trade balance issues, border security cooperation, and defense spending commitments. These were legitimate concerns that many of us shared, and I want to be clear about that. The question was never about whether these issues needed addressing. The question was always about the methodology and its long-term consequences. By March 4th, those tariffs were fully implemented across the board. Canadian steel, aluminum, automobiles, lumber, and manufactured goods were all facing substantial new costs at the border. The initial economic projections were serious and concerning for both sides. Trade economists estimated $50 billion in potential lost Canadian exports annually, possible GDP contraction of 1%, and significant risk to manufacturing employment throughout Ontario and Quebec. Most trade analysts expected Canada would return to negotiations quickly, seeking comprehensive exemption agreements similar to what we had seen in previous trade disputes. That was the conventional wisdom in Washington, and I must admit, I initially shared that assessment. But here's where the situation took an unexpected turn that caught even seasoned observers off guard. And this is where my legal training in game theory and strategic analysis becomes particularly relevant to understanding what happened next. Instead of adopting a defensive posture and rushing to negotiate, Canada shifted strategies entirely under new leadership. In April 2025, former Bank of England Governor and Bank of Canada Chief Mark Carney won a decisive election victory, campaigning explicitly on economic independence and strategic diversification. He ran on a platform that essentially told Canadian voters that their country would never again be vulnerable to unilateral American trade actions. That message resonated powerfully with an electorate that felt their nation was being treated as a subordinate rather than a partner. By November 5th, just 8 months into his premiership, Carney released what his government called Budget 2025. And it wasn't focused on restoring the previous status quo or going back to business as usual. It was a comprehensive plan for long-term economic transformation that would fundamentally alter Canada's position in global trade. The centerpiece was a $500 billion private investment mobilization plan over 5 years, supported by 78. $3 billion in federal strategic spending, representing a 116% increase from the previous fiscal year. These are staggering numbers by any measure, and they signal a level of national commitment that Washington clearly did not anticipate. But this wasn't unplanned deficit expansion or reckless spending driven by political considerations. This was Canada making a calculated decision that it could catalyze $500 billion in private capital by systematically reducing its reliance on the American market from approximately 75% of exports down to below 60% within a decade. That 15 percentage point shift might not sound dramatic on paper, but in trade terms, it represents a fundamental reorientation of an entire national economy. And here's what makes this particularly significant from a strategic policy perspective that I think many observers are missing. By mid-March, the Trump administration had granted USMCA exemptions covering roughly 85% of Canada-US trade after Canada implemented enhanced border security measures that satisfied White House concerns. But Carney didn't reverse his economic pivot strategy when those exemptions came through. He accelerated it because his government determined this wasn't just about managing immediate tariff impacts. This was about ensuring Canada would never again face economic vulnerability from concentrated trade dependence on any single partner, regardless of the political relationship. That distinction is crucial to understanding everything that followed. So, how exactly does Carney's $500 billion strategy work in practical terms? Let me break down the economic mechanisms because this represents sophisticated fiscal policy design of the kind that, frankly, I wish we would see more of in Washington. First, you need to understand that the $500 billion figure isn't direct government expenditure in the traditional sense. It's private sector investment that federal policy is designed to catalyze through strategic incentives and systematic risk reduction for investors. The actual federal commitment totals approximately $150 billion in tax credits, loan guarantees, regulatory streamlining, and targeted subsidies over 5 years. Um, Think of it like this analogy that I find useful for explaining the approach. For every dollar the Canadian government allocates strategically, economic modeling projects that private investors, both domestic and international, will contribute approximately three additional dollars. And that's a leverage ratio that would make any investment banker take notice. The priority sectors include critical infrastructure development, clean energy systems, advanced manufacturing capabilities, technology development across multiple industries, and critical minerals extraction and processing. These aren't random selections driven by political considerations. They represent a deliberate focus on areas where Canada has competitive advantages and where global demand is projected to grow substantially over the coming decades. The strategic coherence of the plan is what distinguishes it from typical government spending programs that often scatter resources across politically motivated priorities without clear economic logic. Here are the specific policy mechanisms driving this investment mobilization that I find most impressive from an analytical standpoint. Canada introduced accelerated capital cost allowances, allowing businesses to write off up to 100% of eligible capital investments in manufacturing and clean technology during the first tax year. That's an enormous incentive for companies considering where to locate new production facilities. They established a new Canada Growth Fund with $25 billion in initial capitalization, specifically targeting clean technology, commercialization, and critical minerals development. These are the raw materials essential for battery production, semiconductor manufacturing, and renewable energy systems that every major economy is competing to secure. They also launched what officials are calling the Major Projects Office, a centralized regulatory approval authority designed to streamline infrastructure projects that would typically require 5 to 7 years of environmental and regulatory review, down to 18 to 24 months through coordinated federal provincial cooperation. But here's the strategically sophisticated element that really caught my attention when I analyzed the details. And this is where I see Carney's background as a central banker showing through in every aspect of the policy design. He connected all these investment incentives to a bio-Canadian procurement framework with real teeth. Any corporation seeking to access these tax credits and subsidies must commit to sourcing a minimum of 60% of inputs from Canadian suppliers or from allied trading partners explicitly structured to reduce systematic dependence on American supply chains where viable alternatives exist. It's economic nationalism implemented through multilateral partnership frameworks rather than isolation. That's a subtle but crucial distinction that separates this approach from crude protectionism. Now, let me address defense spending because this was another significant pressure point in USC Canada relations, and honestly, a fair criticism that I have made myself over the years. Canada had historically underfunded its NATO commitments, maintaining defense spending around 4% of GDP when the alliance target stands at 2%. That was a legitimate grievance that undermined Canadian credibility in security discussions. Carney's budget allocates $81.8 billion over 5 years for military modernization, a spending trajectory that brings Canada to 1. 9% of GDP by 2027 and achieves the full 2% NATO target by 2028. This represents a fundamental shift in Canadian defense policy that addresses long-standing American concerns. Critically, this defense spending isn't just purchasing equipment from foreign suppliers and calling it a day. A substantial portion focuses on building domestic defense manufacturing capacity with projections indicating 40,000 new skilled jobs in aerospace engineering, naval construction, cybersecurity systems, and defense electronics. Canada is simultaneously satisfying NATO requirements and building industrial capacity that further reduces dependence on American defense contractors. The trade diversification component of Carney's strategy is equally comprehensive and equally sophisticated. He announced a $500 billion trade and investment vision specifically with ASEAN countries. That's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations representing 700 million consumers and a combined GDP exceeding 6 trillion. Canada's actively negotiating comprehensive free trade agreements with India, prioritizing expanded trade volumes with the European Union under their existing CDA framework, and exploring deeper economic integration with Japan, South Korea, and other Indo-Pacific partners who are eager for reliable North American trading relationships. Compare this approach to the original NAFTA renegotiation back in 2018, when I was watching closely from the sidelines. During that period, Canada was operating from a defensive position, working desperately to preserve existing market access under considerable pressure. The Trump administration leveraged that dependence effectively to extract concessions on dairy market access, intellectual property protections, and dispute resolution mechanisms. But this time, Canada analyzed the tariff challenge and made an entirely different calculation. If trade access can be weaponized regardless of treaty commitments, if even agreements like USMCA can be undermined through executive action, then we need structural alternatives that provide genuine economic security regardless of who occupies the White House. And here's the historical parallel that should concern trade strategists in Washington, because I've studied enough economic history to recognize these patterns when they emerge. This situation mirrors what happened after the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, when America substantially raised tariffs to protect domestic industries during economic uncertainty. Trading partners didn't just impose retaliatory measures and wait for negotiations. They systematically built entirely new trade networks that bypassed the United States completely. Global trade volumes contracted by 66% over 4 years, and American export industries collapsed in ways that took decades to recover from. The United States lost its position as the undisputed center of global commerce for multiple decades, and arguably never fully regained the dominance it had enjoyed before that catastrophic policy error. Carney is calculating that similar dynamics are emerging today, and preliminary economic data suggests that assessment may have considerable merit. Let me break down who's experiencing gains and losses in the shifting economic reality, because the consequences are already measurable across multiple sectors. And as someone who believes in accountability and honest analysis, we need to look at the real-world impacts objectively rather than through partisan lenses. For Canadian workers and businesses, the initial disruption from tariffs has evolved into what economists are describing as a resilience dividend that's creating unexpected opportunities for those positioned to take advantage of the changing landscape. Take the steel industry as a concrete example of how this transformation is playing out on the ground. U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel reached 50% by June 2025 before settling at 25% under the USMCA exemption framework. Canadian steelmakers lost approximately $3 billion in exports during the first quarter of 2025 alone, and industry analysts predicted widespread plant closures. But Carney's policy response was swift and strategic. His government imposed tariff rate quotas on steel imports to Canada from non-allied nations and provided $22 billion in federal loan guarantees to help companies retool their production facilities for Asian and European market specifications. The results have been remarkable by any measure. By the fourth quarter of 2025, Canadian steel exports to the European Union were up 34% year over year, and shipments to Japan increased 28% compared to the same period in 2024. While Canadian producers sacrifice some American market share in the transition, they're no longer operationally dependent on a single customer who can impose restrictions without warning or meaningful consultation. For a mid-sized manufacturing company in Ontario, let's say an automotive parts supplier with 300 employees, the economic calculation has fundamentally changed in ways that will shape decisions for years to come. Before the Carney administration, they would send 85% of their production output to assembly plants in Detroit and surrounding areas. Now, they're receiving government incentives to diversify strategically in multiple directions. New capital investment tax credits are available if they build production capacity to serve Asian automotive markets. Procurement preferences apply if they supply components to Canadian electric vehicle projects. Export insurance programs exist to reduce financial risk when exploring new international customers. One company representative told Reuters in a November interview something that I found particularly striking. The tariff situation forced us to confront a vulnerability we didn't want to acknowledge. We thought USMCA made us secure. It turns out we were just concentrated in a single risk. That's a profound shift in corporate thinking that will outlast any particular administration in Washington for American businesses and workers. And this is where I need to be absolutely clear about the consequences. This is where economic impacts are becoming visible in quarterly reports and employment data across multiple sectors. The United States exports approximately $350 billion in goods to Canada annually. That's our second largest export market after Mexico. And it's been a reliable destination for American products for generations. When Canada imposed retaliatory tariffs on American steel, aluminum, and agricultural products in March 2025, U.S. farmers in Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota saw wheat and soybean exports to Canada drop 41% year over year through the second quarter. The pain was immediate and severe for agricultural communities that had depended on Canadian markets for decades. Even after those retaliatory tariffs were removed in September, market share hasn't recovered to previous levels because Canadian agricultural buyers established new supplier relationships in Australia, Brazil, and Argentina during the disruption period. Those relationships don't disappear simply because tariffs are removed. The energy sector illustrates similar unintended consequences that rippled through the American Midwest. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of crude oil to the United States, approximately 3 million barrels per day flowing across the border. The 10% tariff on Canadian energy added roughly $15 per barrel in costs for Midwest refineries that lack pipeline access to domestic shale production. That translated to an additional 35 cents per gallon for consumers in Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois throughout spring and summer 2025. Political backlash in those politically competitive states became so intense that the White House granted exemptions relatively quickly, but the impact on consumer confidence in trade policy was already established, and the damage to the administration's credibility in those states was considerable. For the broader North American economy, the economic integration that took 3 decades to build through NAFTA and subsequently USMCA is quietly experiencing structural changes that may prove irreversible regardless of future policy adjustments. Crosser supply chains for automobiles, aerospace manufacturing, and electronics were engineered on the fundamental assumption of relatively seamless trade flows between the United States and Canada. That assumption has now been called into question in ways that corporate planners cannot ignore. A single automobile assembled in Michigan contains an average of $3,400 in Canadian sourced components when those parts suddenly face 25% tariff costs. Even temporarily, automakers like Ford and General Motors had to absorb the additional costs to maintain price competitiveness against Asian and European imports. Ford's second quarter 2025 earnings call specifically cited tariff-related supply chain disruptions as responsible for $2 billion in lost revenue. That's not a rounding error. That's a material impact on one of America's most iconic manufacturing companies. And here's what concerns international trade economists most significantly about the long-term trajectory of this situation. The $500 billion that Carney is mobilizing isn't just replacing lost American trade temporarily, it's funding permanent infrastructure, port expansions on both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, rail network upgrades connecting Canadian producers to new export terminals, clean energy grids that reduce dependence on integrated North American power systems, telecommunications infrastructure that creates redundancy and independence. These investments will make Canada's trade reorientation structurally permanent in ways that cannot be easily reversed through policy adjustments in Washington. Once those capital investments are completed, once those new trade relationships are operationalized with long-term contracts and established business relationships, you simply cannot reverse that economic geography with a stroke of a pen or a new trade agreement. So, what do economic policy experts and trade analysts make of this strategic shift? The assessment from economists and international relations observers has been striking in its consistency across the political spectrum. Canada called the administration's approach and found a viable alternative path. And frankly, this is exactly what I've been warning about for years as these dynamics developed. Lawrence Summers, former Treasury Secretary under President Clinton, and hardly a partisan voice, wrote in the Financial Times in November 2025. Something that I think captures the situation precisely. Prime Minister Carney has demonstrated what happens when a sophisticated economy with strong institutions decides it won't accept a subordinate negotiating position. The $500 billion mobilization isn't just economically impressive. It's a potential blueprint for other middle power economies watching American trade policy become increasingly transactional and less predictable. That observation should concern anyone who cares about American influence in the global economy. Trevor Tome, a trade economist at the University of Calgary who has published extensively on North American economic integration, offered this analysis that I found particularly incisive. The Trump administration wanted to use tariffs as negotiating leverage to extract concessions. Instead, they provided Canada with the political justification to make investments that were economically rational but politically difficult under normal circumstances. Every Canadian provincial premier who was initially skeptical of deficit spending supported the plan once the tariff situation made economic diversification a national priority rather than a partisan policy preference. That's a strategic miscalculation of significant proportions that handed Carney exactly the political cover he needed. And here's where my own analysis becomes particularly relevant because I've been making this argument consistently throughout 2025 to anyone who would listen. The administration's tariff strategy suffers from a fundamental misunderstanding of economic leverage dynamics that I find deeply troubling from someone who has studied these issues for decades. You only maintain effective leverage over a trading partner if they genuinely cannot develop viable alternatives to your market. By making Canada's continued dependence economically risky and demonstrating that even treaty commitments provide insufficient protection, the policy actually incentivized Canada to invest massive resources in building the capacity for permanent diversification. This represents negotiating strategy in reverse. The administration believes it's demonstrating strength through aggressive action. In economic reality, it's creating the precise conditions for long-term American trade isolation from its most reliable and most integrated partners. The political consequences within Canada have been equally notable and deserve attention from anyone analyzing this situation. Carney's approval rating reached 62% by December 2025, a remarkably high figure for a prime minister implementing significant deficit spending during a period of economic uncertainty. The explanation is straightforward when you understand the political dynamics at play. Canadian voters across the political spectrum believe he's standing up for national economic interests rather than accepting a subordinate position in the bilateral relationship. That's a powerful political narrative, and it's resonating well beyond traditional Liberal Party constituencies into conservative regions that typically resist government intervention in the economy. The tariff situation gave Carney permission to implement industrial policy that would have faced fierce opposition under normal circumstances. In Washington, the official reaction has been considerably more complicated than a public statement suggests when you look behind the rhetoric. Congressional Republicans from border states and districts with significant Canadian trade exposure quietly pressured the White House to grant the USMCA exemption in March because constituents were expressing serious concerns about rising costs and supply chain disruptions. Those conversations happened away from cameras, but were consequential in shaping the administration's eventual retreat on the most punitive measures. But the administration faces a fundamental messaging challenge that constrains its options. Acknowledging that the tariff strategy didn't achieve its intended goals and may have actually strengthened Canada's position would undermine the broader America First trade narrative that remains central to political identity. So we're operating in an unusual and somewhat surreal situation where over 85% of Canada-US trade is functionally tariff-free under the exemption framework. But the political rhetoric remains confrontational, and Canada continues building alternative trade infrastructure regardless of the actual state of bilateral commerce. Looking ahead to the medium term, the scenario presents serious challenges for American trade policy that deserve honest assessment. The USMCA agreement comes up for mandatory review in July 2026, now just 6 months away. President Trump has already characterized it as transitional and suggested it may have served its purpose, signaling potential interest in fundamental renegotiation.